The Atlantic Wall was a terrifying 3,000-mile-long fortress of concrete and steel, a barrier in Nazi propaganda that was deemed impregnable. Built by the massive organization taught using forced labor, the defenses included over 15,000 hardened bunkers and coastal artillery emplacements that could shell the English Channel from 20 miles away. The original German strategy, championed by Field Marshal von Rundstedt, viewed this wall as merely a crust or a tripwire. He believed the real fight would happen inland, where Germany's mobile panzer divisions would be held in reserve and then unleashed in a concentrated counterattack after the Allies had landed. This assumption, that the panzers would be held back, was the only chance the Allies had for a successful beach landing. That slim chance disappeared with the arrival of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, who was appointed to fix the wall in late 1943. Rommel was a realist who recognized that Allied air superiority meant any panzers held inland would be destroyed from the air before they could reach the battle. He was convinced the invasion had to be defeated on the beaches, in the water, in the first 24 hours. This famous conviction led him to transform the coastal region into a lethal devil's garden. He ordered millions of mines laid on the sand and strapped to massive steel obstacles like the Czech hedgehogs and Belgian gates, all hidden at high tide to rip apart landing craft. Even inland fields were filled with Rommel's asparagus, millions of wooden poles designed to shred Allied gliders and paratroopers. Rommel's desperate, furious energy turned the Atlantic Wall from a static defense into the most layered, deadly, and sophisticated trap in modern military history. A frontal invasion was now considered suicide. The Allies needed a brilliant deception. The Allied High Command knew the direct assault on the Atlantic Wall was a desperate gamble, so they placed their entire hope for success not on manpower, but on a massive campaign of strategic lies. Operation Fortitude. The entire objective was to fix the German reserve armies, particularly the powerful 15th Army stationed in the Pas-de-Calais, the region closest to Britain and therefore the most logical invasion point, and prevent them from moving to Normandy. To do this, the Allies didn't just need a lie, they needed a convincing performance of an entire second invasion. This phantom invasion was centered around the creation of the first U.S. Army Group, Führer, a massive, entirely fictitious force based in southeast England, directly opposite Calais. The entire Ghost Army was brought to life using an array of decoys, including thousands of inflatable rubber tanks, dummy landing craft, and barracks constructed from scaffolding and canvas, all designed to look completely real from the reconnaissance planes the Germans flew over the area. The most crucial element of this lie was the use of double agents, a handful of spies who the Germans thought were working for them, but who were actually controlled by the British. These agents, collectively known as the double-cross system, were the only way the Allies could guarantee Hitler received the false intelligence they wanted him to believe. The superstar of this network was a Spaniard named Juan Pujol Garcia, codenamed Garbo by the British. Garbo, who the Germans trusted implicitly, ran a fictional network of 27 subagents across Britain. He used his false reports to flood German intelligence with specific details about Führer's supposed size, its training maneuvers, and its invasion date, which he claimed was aimed at Calais in mid-July, after the Normandy diversion failed. To seal the deal, the Allies placed their most feared general, George S. Patton, in command of Führer, ensuring that the Führer Germans would interpret every staged radio transmission and every public sighting of Patton as absolute proof that the main attack was coming to Pas-de-Calais. The final, desperate phase of the deception began in the pre-dawn darkness of the 6th of June 1944. The Allies launched a triple-pronged tactical attack to blind German sensors, confuse their commanders, and draw their forces away from the 5 invasion beaches. In the air, Operation Titanic used over 500 burlap and straw Rupert dummies, or paradummies, dropped by the Royal Air Force over fields miles from the actual landing zones. Some of these dummies were rigged with small explosives to simulate the sound of a paratrooper destroying his parachute and set off pyrotechnics to mimic rifle fire. Crucially, A handful of elite SAS soldiers jumped alongside them, playing recorded battle noises from loudspeakers to convince German patrols that a major airborne division had landed in the wrong location. At the same time, the real paratroopers of the U.S. 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions and the British 6th Airborne Division were making their crucial, silent drops to seize key objectives like Pegasus Bridge and secure the flanks of the actual invasion area. The sea invasion itself was masked by its own spectacular, coordinated lie: Operation Taxable and Operation Glimmer. The most critical German threat was its coastal radar, which could track the real 5,000-ship invasion fleet. To defeat this, the RAF deployed thousands of pounds of window-small strips of aluminum foil, also known as chaff, cut to the exact wavelength of German radar. Aircraft flew precise, looping circuits over the English Channel, slowly dropping the chaff to create a moving, ghost signal that appeared on German radar screens as two massive invasion fleets heading straight for the Pas-de-Calais region. Beneath these radar clouds, small naval vessels towed enormous radar-reflecting balloons and played pre-recorded radio chatter to complete the illusion. German commanders, having received months of false reports from Agent Garbo and now seeing two massive phantom fleets on their radar headed for the 15th Army sector, remained absolutely convinced that the Normandy landings were nothing more than a feint. They held their main reserves, waiting for the real attack that would never come. The German reaction on the morning of June 6 was precisely the muddled, paralyzed response the Allies had gambled on. Despite the colossal size of the true invasion fleet and the heavy fighting on the 5 beaches, the German High Command remained fixated on the Pas-de-Calais. Reports of the Rupert dummies and the scattered, confused SAS teams from Operation Titanic led them to believe the paratroop drops in Normandy were disorganized. Small-scale raids meant only to distract them. The most crucial intelligence came from the double agent, Garbo, who radioed Berlin on D-Day morning that the Normandy landings were a diversionary maneuver to draw German forces south, clearing the way for the main decisive strike by General Patton's fictional army, Führer, on Calais in the coming weeks. Garbo's final transmission cemented the deception. Adolf Hitler personally believed Garbo and was utterly convinced the real battle was yet to come. The most devastating consequence of this success was the immobility of the Germans' most powerful reserve force, the 15th Army, commanded by Generaloberst Hans von Salmuth. This army, consisting of 19 infantry and 2 panzer divisions, fresh, well-equipped, and held specifically to fight Patton's Phantom Force, remained rigidly deployed in the Pas-de-Calais region. Hitler refused pleas from his field commanders to release these divisions to counterattack the beaches, fearing a catastrophic trap. The decision to hold these 21 divisions, roughly 150,000 men in reserve, allowed the Allied foothold in Normandy to stabilize and expand over the crucial first 3 weeks of the invasion, which was the difference between success and catastrophic failure. The greatest measure of Operation Fortitude's success was not just the confusion it caused on D-Day, but its continued paralyzing effect in the weeks that followed. Even as the Allies fought their way off the 5 landing beaches and began pushing inland toward Haine and Cherbourg, the German High Command remained certain that the Normandy operation was merely a prelude. This conviction was repeatedly reinforced by Agent Garbo, who kept feeding detailed, manufactured intelligence about Führer's readiness and its imminent attack on the Pas-de-Calais. Every day the Allies held the beachhead was a victory for the deception team, because every day General Salmuth's 15th Army sat idle, waiting for a non-existent enemy. It wasn't until 7 full weeks after D-Day, in late July 1944, that Hitler finally began to accept that the main invasion had already occurred and reluctantly ordered the first troop movements out of Calais. By that time, the delay had been fatal for the German defense of France. The vast majority of the German army's mobile reserves, the Panzer divisions needed for a decisive counterattack, were either held in the Pas-de-Calais or were destroyed piecemeal as they slowly transferred to the Normandy. Battlefield, constantly vulnerable to Allied air attack. The deception had given the Allied armies the critical time they needed to secure their bridgehead, bring ashore millions of tons of supplies via their temporary mulberry harbors, and build up the power necessary for the breakout operation. The elaborate, year-long effort to trick the Germans into defending a ghost front ultimately succeeded in diverting 21 crucial divisions, proving that the bodyguard of lies was just as vital as the tanks and troops that landed on the beaches. The individuals responsible for the Great Deception were recognized for their work, often in secret. General George S. Patton, who faithfully commanded the Ghost Army Führer, was finally unleashed in August 1944. His real-life Third Army executed a blistering breakout across France, advancing farther and faster than any other Allied force, proving he was the strategic weapon the Germans feared all along. The deception's architect, double agent Juan Pujol Garcia, Garbo, was granted the Iron Cross by the Germans, who still believed he had warned them of the diversion, and was simultaneously awarded the MBE by King George VI, one of the only people in history to be decorated by both sides in a single war. He survived the conflict and later lived quietly in Venezuela, his true role remaining a secret for decades. The end came for the German 15th Army not in a glorious defensive stand at Calais, but in a humiliating strategic defeat months later. After finally being released from the Pas-de-Calais in late August, the divisions were ordered to retreat toward the Netherlands. They were largely spared the destruction that fell upon the German forces trapped in the Falaise pocket. But in September 1944, they were cornered by Allied forces in Belgium and the Netherlands. Commander-in-Chief Hans von Salmuth was relieved of command, and the once mighty army spent months being slowly, bitterly defeated as they attempted a desperate escape across the Scheldt estuary, leaving behind a ruined German flank and confirming the complete success of the Allied deception campaign. Once the Allies had successfully established their foothold, the battle immediately transitioned from an amphibious assault to a brutal, grinding land war. The initial D-Day objectives, specifically the capture of the key city of Caen and the port of Cherbourg, had not been met on June 6th. The British and Canadians found themselves immediately stalled by fierce counterattacks, particularly from the well-armed 21st Panzer Division, which was one of the few German armored units Rommel had managed to deploy close to the coast. This forced a massive, sustained battle of attrition around Caen that lasted for over a month. Meanwhile, the American forces on the western flank were advancing into the bocage, a labyrinthine landscape of small fields surrounded by thick, high hedgerows built up over centuries. The Norman bocage transformed the war into a slow, terrifying infantry struggle. Each hedgerow, or talus, became a miniature fortress for the German defenders. Visibility was nearly zero. Artillery fire was useless against entrenched positions, and tanks were easily ambushed when trying to climb over the earth banks. The Americans were bleeding out, losing crucial time and men, and faced a serious morale crisis. The German strategy, championed by Field Marshal Rommel before he was wounded, was working perfectly. They were forcing the Allies to fight in an environment that negated Allied air and armor superiority. Consuming the Allied war machine one hedgerow at a time, the Allies realized they needed a revolutionary solution to break the stalemate, or the entire operation risked bogging down into a static war of trenches. Faced with the terrifying stalemate of the bocage, where hundreds of square miles of dense, elevated hedgerows turned every small field into a killing ground, American infantry were suffering catastrophic casualties. To break the deadlock, a solution had to be found to overcome the earthen banks, which stopped tanks dead in their tracks. The answer came from an unexpected source: Sergeant Curtis G. Cullen, a tank mechanic. Cullen noticed that scrap steel recovered from German beach obstacles Czech hedgehogs, might be modified. His idea was simple yet revolutionary. Weld 4 long, sharp steel blades, a massive spiked plow, to the front of a Sherman tank. The result was the Rhino tank, or Cullen hedgerow cutter. These tanks could now charge the hedgerows, slicing through the thick roots and earth banks rather than attempting to climb over them, thus maintaining their momentum and preventing the exposure of their vulnerable underbellies to German anti-tank fire. This technical innovation, born of desperation in the field, was quickly approved by General Omar Bradley. Thousands of tanks were rapidly fitted with the Rhino cutters in a massive field operation. The subsequent deployment of the Rhino tanks restored mobility to the battlefield, allowing the Americans to finally fight their way out of the suffocating bocage, setting the stage for the dramatic operational breakthrough that would follow. With the introduction of the Rhino tanks finally offering a way to penetrate the deadly bocage, General Omar Bradley developed a daring and massive plan to break the Normandy stalemate, Operation Cobra. The core idea was to concentrate an overwhelming volume of firepower onto a narrow, specific German-held sector near Saint-Lô, followed immediately by a massive armored charge. The initial punch was delivered by thousands of Allied aircraft. For 5 full days, Allied bombers flew continuous missions, effectively turning the German front lines into a smoking, pulverized wasteland. Unfortunately, due to a severe navigation error and an initial drop falling short, the bombing also caused significant friendly fire casualties among the waiting American infantry, including the tragic death of Lieutenant General Leslie J. McNair, the highest-ranking American officer killed in the European theater. Despite the friendly fire, the bombing did its intended job. It completely shattered the provisioned German defenses, vaporizing command posts and paralyzing the German command structure. On the 25th of July, 1944, following the devastating aerial bombardment, 7 Allied divisions led by the newly formed and much-feared 3rd U.S. Army, commanded by the now unleashed General George S. Patton, surged into the gap. The breach was so total that Patton's tanks were immediately able to execute the lightning-fast deep thrust they had been designed for. Operation Cobra cracked the German front wide open, and within days, the American forces were flooding out of Normandy, initiating the race across France that marked the end of the static warfare and the beginning of the German rout in the West. The success of Operation Cobra was so complete that the German command realized their front was on the verge of total disintegration. To prevent a catastrophic rout, Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, who had replaced the wounded Rommel, proposed a desperate, all-or-nothing armored counterattack. This operation, codenamed Lutic, also known as the Mortain counterattack, was approved by Hitler himself, who was convinced that a successful thrust could cut off the American spearheads and roll up the entire Normandy front. Hitler demanded that the attack must be conducted by armored forces from the Pas-de-Calais, finally convinced the invasion was genuine. On the night of the 6th of August 1944, 4 elite German Panzer divisions, including the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, launched their attack near the town of Mortain, aiming to slice directly to the coast at Avranches. Had they succeeded, they would have trapped the bulk of Patton's Third Army, which was already deep in the French interior. However, Allied intelligence, aided by ultra-intercepts, was fully aware of the plan. Despite initial gains, the German attack stalled due to determined American defense, especially by the 30th Infantry Division, terrain difficulties, and the immediate, overwhelming response from the Allied Tactical Air Force. Pinned down in the open by relentless fighter-bomber attacks, the German armored columns were systematically destroyed from the air. The failure of Operation Lutic not only wasted Germany's last mobile reserves in the West, but also created the precise condition for the greatest encirclement of the campaign. While the German front in Normandy was collapsing under Operation Cobra, a momentous event occurred far from the battlefield. that profoundly affected the war's outcome. The July 20 plot, Operation Valkyrie. A conspiracy of high-ranking military officers, disillusioned with Hitler's disastrous command and seeking to negotiate peace with the Western Allies, planted a bomb inside the Führer's headquarters, the Wolf's Lair. On the 20th of July, 1944, the bomb detonated, but Hitler survived with only minor injuries. The failure of the coup was immediately followed by a brutal and sweeping purge across the Wehrmacht. Thousands of people, many of whom were simply suspected of disloyalty or were merely acquaintances of the conspirators, were arrested, tortured, and executed. The most significant consequence for the war in the West was that it removed any final restraint on Hitler's strategic command. He now trusted only fanatics and demanded absolute, unthinking obedience. This paranoia directly led to his disastrous command to launch Operation Luttich, which Field Marshal von Kluge knew was suicidal. The purges also ensured that Field Marshal Rommel, who was already recovering from wounds sustained in an Allied air attack and was implicated in the plot, was forced to commit suicide to spare his family from the Gestapo. The plot thus eliminated the last voices of military reason, locking the German army onto a catastrophic path of futile, fanatical defense. The failure of the German counteroffensive, Operation Luttich, Chapter 9, had a devastating strategic effect. The German 7th Army and Panzer Group West were now concentrated in a salient, a massive bulge in the front lines around the town of Falaise. Recognizing the opportunity, the Allied armies executed a brilliant, rapid maneuver to encircle them. The American forces, having broken out with Operation Cobra, swung north, while the British and Canadians pushed south from the Caen sector. The aim was to link up and seal off the entire German force. The gap was closing quickly between the American forces near Argentan and the Canadian-Polish forces near Falaise. Field Marshal von Kluge, recognizing the imminent disaster, began a frantic withdrawal, attempting to pull his men out of the shrinking pocket. The final desperate task of closing the gap fell to the Polish 1st Armored Division, who seized the high ground of Mont Ormel, known as the Mace. They held this vital escape route against ferocious German attacks for 3 days, even as the remaining gap became known as the Corridor of Death. The closing of the Falaise pocket proved to be the decisive battle of the entire Normandy campaign. By the 21st of August 1944, the Polish and American forces finally sealed the ring, trapping an estimated 50,000 to 60,000 German soldiers inside the pocket. What followed was a massacre. The German forces inside, lacking food, fuel, and command structure, panicked and attempted to escape through the narrow corridor of death. Allied artillery and tactical air power, typhoons and thunderbolts, descended upon the desperate columns of men, tanks, and vehicles jamming the roads. The concentration of men and material was so dense that the Allied forces could simply saturate the area with shells and bombs, creating an unprecedented level of destruction. The pocket became a charnel house. The stench of decaying flesh from thousands of dead men and horses was overwhelming. Though approximately 20,000 to 30,000 Germans managed to escape the encirclement, the German 7th Army was effectively destroyed as a fighting force, leaving behind 10,000 killed, 50,000 captured, and almost all of their heavy equipment. With the German army annihilated at Falaise, the path to Paris lay virtually open. The last vestiges of German organized resistance in France were gone. The Allied High Command had initially planned to bypass Paris to avoid a prolonged siege and save time, but pressure from Free French leader General Charles de Gaulle, combined with news of an anti-German uprising by the French resistance inside the city, forced a change of plans. De Gaulle feared that French communists might seize control of the capital before the Allies arrived. On the 24th of August 1944, the French 2nd Armored Division, commanded by General Philippe Leclerc, was given the honor of spearheading the advance into Paris. They entered the city late that evening, quickly followed by the American 4th Infantry Division. The German commander of Paris, General Dietrich von Choltitz, defied Hitler's explicit order to destroy the city's major monuments and bridges, surrendering Paris on August 25th. The liberation of the capital, marked by joyous celebrations in the streets and General de Gaulle's triumphal march down the Champs-Élysées, was a profound symbolic victory that signaled the effective end of the campaign in France and boosted Allied morale across the globe. Following the spectacular success of the Falaise breakout and the liberation of Paris, the Allied forces, particularly Patton's Third Army, launched an unprecedented high-speed advance across France. They were racing toward the German border and the River Rhine, covering distances of up to 50 miles a day. However, this headlong rush created a massive immediate crisis: logistics. The Allied supply chain could not keep pace with the rapidly moving front lines. Everything fuel, ammunition, food, and spare parts still had to be transported hundreds of miles from the small, damaged ports in Normandy, primarily Cherbourg. To overcome this, the Allies organized one of the greatest trucking operations in military history, the Red Ball Express. Named after the railroad term for high-priority freight, this massive, one-way system utilized thousands of trucks, mostly driven by African-American soldiers, who worked in continuous 24-hour convoys. Dedicated military police managed the 700-mile loop of roads, which were closed to civilian traffic to ensure a constant flow of materiel. While the Red Ball Express delivered over 12,500 tons of supplies a day at its peak, it still wasn't enough. The sheer consumption of fuel by the armored divisions, often requiring 750,000 gallons of gasoline per day, forced the Allied command to make difficult choices, prioritizing certain armies and effectively starving others, a problem that would directly influence future strategic decisions. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, commanding the 21st Army Group, British and Canadian forces, passionately advocated for a single thrust, a massive, prioritized, and highly concentrated offensive, primarily his own, aimed directly at the industrial heartland of Germany, the Ruhr Valley. Montgomery argued that by temporarily halting other fronts and funneling all available supplies, especially fuel, into this single narrow corridor, they could punch through the thinly held German defenses, cross the Rhine River quickly, and end the war before Christmas 1944. This strategy hinged on the immediate capture of a major port closer to the front. In opposition, Generals Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander, and Omar Bradley, commanding the 12th Army Group, primarily American forces, favored a broad front approach. They argued that stopping all other advances to feed one thrust would allow the Germans time to concentrate their remaining reserves and crush the single spearhead, risking a catastrophic defeat. The broad front strategy called for a synchronized advance across a wide line, maintaining pressure everywhere, destroying the German army piecemeal, and allowing Allied forces to secure and utilize more ports along the French coast, like Marseille and Antwerp, to permanently solve the supply problem. Eisenhower ultimately adopted a modified broad front, which disappointed Montgomery and led to increasing friction among the Allies. Frustrated by the slow pace of the broad front and desperate to launch his decisive single thrust, Field Marshal Montgomery secured approval for Operation Market Garden in September 1944. This was the largest airborne operation in history, a daring plan to use 3 airborne divisions to seize a series of 9 critical bridges deep inside the Netherlands, culminating with the seizure of the bridge over the Rhine at Arnhem. The subsequent ground forces, Garden, primarily the British 20X Corps, would then rush the 60 miles up a single, narrow road to link up with the paratroopers and establish a northern corridor for the invasion of Germany. The operation was based on severe risks and optimistic intelligence. Crucially, the British 1st Airborne Division, tasked with taking the Arnhem Bridge, landed directly onto positions unknowingly occupied by two resting veteran SS Panzer divisions, the 9th and 10th. The plan immediately unraveled. The British paratroopers, suffering from poor radio communications, were unable to hold the bridge, and the ground relief column faced determined German resistance, including relentless, successful attacks on the narrow supply road, the Hell's Highway. After 9 days of brutal fighting, the British 1st Airborne was destroyed, suffering over 7,500 casualties. The failure of Market Garden meant the vital northern entry point into Germany was sealed. The war would not end in 1944, and the Allies were still forced to rely on the difficult broad front strategy. Following the dramatic failures and successes of the summer, the campaign devolved into a necessary, grinding struggle for infrastructure that Eisenhower knew was essential for the long war ahead. The immense supply demands of the advancing armies could only be met by securing a major port closer than Cherbourg. The most promising was Antwerp, the third largest port in the world, which had been captured almost intact by the British 11th Armored Division on September 4th. However, the port itself was useless until the Scheldt estuary, a 50-mile-long river approach to Antwerp, was cleared of German occupation. The task of clearing the estuary and the islands surrounding it fell to the Canadian First Army. What followed was a difficult, slow, and brutal battle, lasting from early October to early November. The Germans, under the command of General Kurt Student, fought tenaciously, flooding the flat terrain and resisting from fortifications on the islands of Walcheren and South Beveland. The Battle of the Scheldt resulted in high casualties but ultimately succeeded, and the first Allied convoys entered Antwerp in late November 1944. Securing Antwerp finally solved the logistics crisis, but the delay had given the Germans critical weeks to consolidate their defenses along the Siegfried Line. With the logistics problem easing, the Allied armies turned their attention to the formidable obstacle of the Siegfried Line, known to the Germans as the West Wall. This was a belt of hundreds of concrete bunkers, pillboxes, anti-tank obstacles, dragon's teeth, and tunnels running along Germany's western border. General Bradley planned to breach this line to seize the city of Aachen, the first major German city on the Western Front. The battle for Aachen became a fierce and costly test of German will. The Germans refused to surrender the historic city, forcing the Americans to undertake a difficult house-to-house urban fight. Meanwhile, in the heavily forested, rough terrain to the south, the Americans entered the Hürtgen Forest, seeking to protect the flank of the Aachen operation. What ensued was a 4-month, hellish battle of attrition in the dense woods. The terrain nullified Allied air support, and the fighting was reduced to small unit engagements in muddy, cold ravines. The Battle of the Hürtgen Forest ultimately cost the U.S. Army over 33,000 casualties and yielded little strategic gain, but it effectively served as a shield for the subsequent Allied actions to the north. As Allied armies pressed toward the German heartland, Hitler unleashed a weapon of terror against Britain and Allied-held territory, the V-weapons, vengeance weapons. The V-1 flying bomb, Buzz Bomb, was an unpiloted cruise missile, while the more advanced V-2 rocket was the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile. Launched from sites across the Netherlands and Western Germany, these weapons were impossible to intercept and struck London, Antwerp, and other key targets, causing thousands of civilian casualties and significant damage. The V-weapons were a strategic failure. They did not significantly affect the Allied war effort, and the resources used to produce them would have been better spent on tanks and aircraft for the front line. However, they had a profound psychological impact, forcing the British population to endure a new kind of aerial terror after the Blitz had subsided. The relentless V-2 attacks on the newly opened port of Antwerp caused major disruptions to supply unloading, further highlighting the Germans' commitment to total war and reinforcing the desperate need for the Allies to push beyond the launch range. By late November 1944, the initial momentum of the Normandy breakout had been exhausted. The Allies had successfully liberated France and Belgium and had breached the Siegfried Line in places, but their armies were battered by heavy casualties from the Scheldt, Aachen, and the Hürtgen forest. The onset of a harsh winter and the continued, albeit slowed, German resistance led to a period of strategic stalemate. General Eisenhower was forced to formally abandon any pretense of a single, quick end to the war. He finalized his commitment to the broad front strategy, ordering a general offensive across the entire line to be launched early in the new year. Crucially, the logistics success achieved by the opening of the port of Antwerp in late November allowed the Supreme Commander to begin storing massive reserves of supplies and ammunition for this planned offensive. The American lines, though stretched, were generally considered secure for the winter. However, completely unknown to the Allies, Hitler was preparing a massive, audacious gamble, pooling his last remaining strategic reserves for a final, catastrophic counterattack aimed directly at the weakest point of the Allied line,